The foreign policy of the United States is the way in which it interacts with foreign nations and sets standards of interaction for its organizations, corporations and individual citizens. The officially stated goals of the foreign policy of the United States, including all the bureaus and offices in the United States Department of State, as mentioned in the foreign policy agenda of the Department of State, are to build and sustain a more democratic, secure, and prosperous world for the benefit of the American people and the international community. Quote, in addition, the United States House Committee on Foreign Affairs states as some of its jurisdictional goals, export controls, including non-proliferation of nuclear technology and nuclear hardware, measures to foster commercial interaction with foreign nations and to safeguard American business abroad, international commodity agreements, international education, and protection of American citizens abroad, and expatriation. U.S. foreign policy and foreign aid have been the subject of much debate, praise and criticism, both domestically and abroad. Powers of the President and Congress. Subject to the advice and consent role of the U.S. Senate, the President of the United States negotiates treaties with foreign nations, but treaties enter into force if ratified by two-thirds of the Senate. The President is also Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, and as such has broad authority over the armed forces. However, only Congress has authority to declare war, and the civilian and military budget is written by the Congress. The United States Secretary of State is the Foreign Minister of the United States and is the primary conductor of state-to-state diplomacy. Both the Secretary of State and ambassadors are appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. Congress also has power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Historical overview. The main trend regarding the history of U.S. foreign policy since the American Revolution is the shift from non-interventionism before and after World War I, to its growth as a world power and global hegemony during and since World War II and the end of the Cold War in the 20th century. Since the 19th century, U.S. foreign policy also has been characterized by a shift from the realist school to the idealistic Wilsonian school of international relations. Foreign policy themes were expressed considerably in George Washington's farewell address. These included, among other things, observing good faith and justice towards all nations and cultivating peace and harmony with all, excluding both inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others. Steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, and advocating trade with all nations. These policies became the basis of the Federalist Party in the 1790s, but the rival Jeffersonians feared Britain and favored France in the 1790s, declaring the War of 1812 on Britain. After the 1778 alliance with France, the U.S. did not sign another permanent treaty until the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949. Over time, other themes, key goals, attitudes, or stances have been variously expressed by presidential doctrines named for them. Initially these were uncommon events, but since World War II, these have been made by most presidents. In general, the United States followed an isolationist foreign policy until attacks against U.S. shipping by Barbary corsairs spurred the country into developing a naval force projection capability, resulting in the First Barbary War in 1801. Despite occasional entanglements with European powers such as the War of 1812 and the 1898 Spanish-American War, U.S. foreign policy was marked by steady expansion of its foreign trade and scope during the 19th century, and it maintained its policy of avoiding wars with and between European European powers. Concerning its domestic borders, the 1803 Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's geographical area. Spain ceded the territory of Florida in 1819. Annexation brought Texas in 1845. A war with Mexico in 1848 added California, Arizona and New Mexico. The U.S. bought Alaska from the Russian Empire in 1867, and it annexed the Republic of Hawaii in 1898. Victory over Spain in 1898 brought the Philippines and Puerto Rico, as well as oversight of Cuba. The short experiment in imperialism ended by 1908 as the U.S. turned its attention to the Panama Canal and the stabilization of regions to its south, including Mexico. 20th century World War I. The 20th century was marked by two world wars in which the United States, along with Allied powers, defeated its enemies and increased its international reputation. President Wilson's 14 points was developed from his idealistic Wilsonianism program of spreading democracy and fighting militarism so as to end any wars. It became the basis of the German armistice and the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, due to European allies' punitive and territorial designs, showed insufficient conformity with these points, and the U.S. signed separate treaties with each of its adversaries. Due to Senate objections also, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations, which was established as a result of Wilson's initiative. In the 1920s, the United States followed an independent course, and succeeded in a program of naval disarmament, and refunding the German economy. New York became the financial capital of the world, but the Wall Street crash of 1929 hurled the Western industrialized world into the Great Depression. American trade policy relied on high tariffs under the Republicans, and reciprocal trade agreements under the Democrats. But in any case, exports were at very low levels in the 1930s. World War II. The United States adopted a non-interventionist foreign policy from 1932 to 1938, but then President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved towards strong support of the Allies in the wars against Germany and Japan. As a result of intense internal debate, the national policy was one of becoming the arsenal of democracy, that is, financing and equipping the Allied armies without sending American combat soldiers. Roosevelt mentioned four fundamental freedoms, which ought to be enjoyed by people everywhere in the world. These included the freedom of speech and religion, as well as freedom from want and fear. Roosevelt helped establish terms for a post-war world among potential allies at the Atlantic Conference. Specific points were included to correct earlier failures, which became a step toward the United Nations. American policy was to threaten Japan, to force it out of China, and to prevent its attacking the Soviet Union. However, Japan reacted by an attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and the United States was at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. Instead of the loans given to allies in World War I, the United States provided Lend-Lease grants of $50 billion. Working closely with Winston Churchill of Britain and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Roosevelt sent his forces into the Pacific against Japan, then into North Africa against Italy and Germany, and finally into Europe, starting with France and Italy in 1944 against the Germans. The American economy roared forward, doubling industrial production and building vast quantities of airplanes, ships, tanks, munitions, and, finally, the atomic bomb. Much of the American war effort went to strategic bombers, which flattened the cities of Japan and Germany. Cold War. After the war, the U.S. rose to become the dominant non-colonial economic power with broad influence in much of the world, with the key policies of the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. Almost immediately, however, the world witnessed division into broad two camps during the Cold War. One side was led by the U.S. and the other by the Soviet Union, but this situation also led to the establishment of the non-aligned movement. This period lasted until almost the end of the 20th century, and is thought to be both an ideological and power struggle between the two superpowers. A policy of containment was adopted to limit Soviet expansion, and a series of proxy wars were fought with mixed results. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved into separate nations, and the Cold War formally ended as the United States gave separate diplomatic recognition to the Russian Federation and other former Soviet states. With these changes to 45 years of established diplomacy and military confrontation, new challenges confronted U.S. policymakers. American foreign policy is characterized by the protection of its national interests. 21st century. In the 21st century, U.S. influence remains strong but, in relative terms, is declining in terms of economic output compared to rising nations such as China, India, Russia, Brazil, and the newly consolidated European Union. Substantial problems remain, such as climate change, nuclear proliferation, and the specter of nuclear terrorism. Foreign policy analysts Oshigian and Sudfan in the book The Next American Century suggest all six powers have similar vested interests in stability and terrorism prevention and trade. If they can find common ground, then the next decades may be marked by peaceful growth and prosperity. Law. In the United States, there are three types of treaty-related law. Executive agreements. Congressional executive agreements are made by the President and Congress. A majority of both houses makes it binding, much like regular legislation after it is signed by the President. The Constitution does not expressly state that these agreements are allowed, and constitutional scholars such as Lawrence Tribe think they are unconstitutional. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the validity. Sole executive agreements are made by the President alone. Treaties are formal written agreements specified by the treaty clause of the Constitution. The President makes a treaty with foreign powers, but then the proposed treaty must be ratified by a two-thirds vote in the Senate. For example, President Wilson proposed the Treaty of Versailles after World War I after consulting with Allied powers, but this treaty was rejected by the U.S. Senate. As a result, the U.S. subsequently made separate agreements with different nations. While most international law has a broader interpretation of the term treaty, the U.S. sense of the term is more restricted. In Missouri v. Holland, the Supreme Court ruled that the power to make treaties under the U.S. Constitution is a power separate from the other enumerated powers of the federal government, and hence the federal government can use treaties to legislate in areas which would otherwise fall within the exclusive authority of the states. International law in most nations considers all three of the above agreements as treaties. In most nations, treaty laws supersede domestic law. So if there is a conflict between a treaty obligation and a domestic law, then the treaty usually prevails. In contrast to most other nations, the United States considers the three types of agreements as distinct. Further, the United States incorporates treaty law into the body of U.S. federal law. As a result, Congress can modify or repeal treaties afterwards. It can overrule an agreed-upon treaty obligation even if this is seen as a violation of the treaty under international law. Several U.S. court rulings confirmed this understanding, including the 1900 Supreme Court decision in Paquet-Urbana, a late 1950s decision in Reed v. Covert, and a lower court ruling in 1986 in Garcia-Mir v. Meese. Further, the Supreme Court has declared itself as having the power to rule a treaty as void by declaring it unconstitutional, although as of 2011, it has never exercised this power. The State Department has taken the position that the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties represents established law. Generally, when the U.S. signs a treaty, it is binding. However, because of the Reed v. Covert decision, the U.S. adds a reservation to the text of every treaty that says, in effect, that the U.S. intends to abide by the treaty, but if the treaty is found to be in violation of the Constitution, then the U.S. legally can't abide by the treaty since the U.S. signature would be ultra-vires. International agreements. The United States has ratified and participates in many other multilateral treaties, including arms control treaties, human rights treaties, environmental protocols, and free trade agreements. Economic and general government. The United States is a founding member of the United Nations and most of its specialized agencies, notably including the World Bank Group and International Monetary Fund. The U.S. has at times withheld payment of dues due to disagreements with the UN. The United States is also member of Organization of American States, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, NAFTA, the regional trade bloc with Canada and Mexico, World Trade Organization, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, Group of Eight, World Customs Organization, freely associated states, after it captured the islands from Japan during World War II. The United States administered the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands from 1947 to 1986. The Northern Mariana Islands became U.S. territory, while Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau became independent countries. Each has signed a compact of free association that gives the United States exclusive military access in return for U.S. defense protection and conduct of military foreign affairs and a few $1 billion of aid. These agreements also generally allow citizens of these countries to live and work in the United States with their spouses, and provide for largely free trade. The federal government also grants access to services from domestic agencies, including the Federal Emergency Management Agency, National Weather Service, the United States Postal Service, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, and U.S. representation to the International Frequency Registration Board of the International Telecommunication Union. Non-participation in multilateral agreements. The United States notably does not participate in various international agreements adhered to by almost all other industrialized countries, by almost all the countries of the Americas, or by almost all other countries in the world, with a large population and economy. On a practical level, this can undermine the effect of certain agreements, or give other countries a precedent to cite for non-participation in various agreements. In some cases, the arguments against participation include that the United States should maximize its sovereignty and freedom of action, or that ratification would create a basis for lawsuits that would treat American citizens unfairly. In other cases, the debate became involved in domestic political issues, such as gun control, climate change, and the death penalty. Examples include Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations Covenant. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. American Convention on Human Rights. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Convention on the Rights of the Child, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Mine Ban Treaty, International Criminal Court, Kyoto Protocol, Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Convention on Cluster Munitions, International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, Arms Trade Treaty, other human rights treaties. Hub and spoke versus multilateral. While America's relationships with Europe have tended to be in terms of multilateral frameworks, such as NATO, America's relations with Asia have tended to be based on a hub and spoke model using a series of bilateral relationships where states coordinate with the United States and do not collaborate with each other. On May 30, 2009, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Defense Secretary Robert M. Gates urged the nations of Asia to build on this hub-and-spoke model as they established and grew multilateral institutions such as ASEAN, APEC and the ad hoc arrangements in the area. However, in 2011 Gates said that the United States must serve as the indispensable nation for building multilateral cooperation. Oil. Persian Gulf. As of 2014, the U.S. currently produces about 66% of the oil that it consumes, while its imports have exceeded domestic production since the early 1990s. New hydraulic fracturing techniques and discovery of shale oil deposits in Canada and the American Dakotas offer the potential for increased energy independence from oil-exporting countries such as OPEC. Former U.S. President George W. Bush identified dependence on imported oil as an urgent national security concern. Two-thirds of the world's proven oil reserves are estimated to be found in the Persian Gulf. Despite its distance, the Persian Gulf region was first proclaimed to be of national interest to the United States during World War II. Petroleum is of central importance to modern armies, and the United States, as the world's leading oil producer at the time, supplied most of the oil for the Allied armies. Many U.S. strategists were concerned that the war would dangerously reduce the U.S. oil supply, and so they sought to establish good relations with Saudi Arabia, a kingdom with large oil reserves. The Persian Gulf region continued to be regarded as an area of vital importance to the United States during the Cold War. Three Cold War United States presidential doctrines, the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, and the Nixon Doctrine, played roles in the formulation of the Carter Doctrine, which stated that the United States would use military force if necessary to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf region. Carter's successor, President Ronald Reagan, extended the policy in October 1981 with what is sometimes called the Reagan Corollary to the Carter Doctrine, which proclaimed that the United States would intervene to protect Saudi Arabia, whose security was threatened after the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War. Some analysts have argued that the implementation of the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Corollary also played a role in the outbreak of the 2003 Iraq War. Canada. Almost all of Canada's energy exports go to the United States, making it the largest foreign source of U.S. energy imports. Canada is consistently among the top sources for U.S. oil imports, and it is the largest source of U.S. natural gas and electricity imports. Africa. In 2007, the U.S. was Sub-Saharan Africa's largest single export market, accounting for 28.4% of exports. 81% of U.S. imports from this region were petroleum products. Foreign aid. Foreign assistance is a core component of the State Department's international affairs budget, which is $49 billion in all for 2014. Aid is considered an essential instrument of U.S. foreign policy. There are four major categories of non-military foreign assistance: bilateral development aid, economic assistance supporting U.S. political and security goals, humanitarian aid, and multilateral economic contributions. In absolute dollar terms, the United States government is the largest international aid donor. The U.S. Agency for International Development manages the bulk of bilateral economic assistance. The Treasury Department handles most multilateral aid. In addition, many private agencies, churches, and philanthropies provide aid. Although the United States is the largest donor in absolute dollar terms, it is actually ranked 19 out of 27 countries on the Commitment to Development Index. The CDR ranks the 27 richest donor countries on the policies that affect the developing world. In the aid component, the United States is penalized for low net aid volume as a share of the economy, a large share of tied or partially tied aid, and a large share of aid given to less poor and relatively undemocratic governments. Foreign aid is a highly partisan issue in the United States, with liberals, on average, supporting foreign aid much more than conservatives do.